Okay, so we've just completed the creation of our wrist control, but we're not quite done with our arm setup yet. If you recall earlier, I mentioned that we're going to do something a little bit interesting with our lower arm. We need to set up our lower arm a little bit differently than it currently is, because if we think about this, our bones aren't quite behaving in a way that the arm really behaves. Take your hand and hold your wrist out in front of you. If you look at your wrist, when you rotate your wrist around the axis that runs up your lower arm, for example, if we took our wrist control and rotate it, we'd be rotating on the Z axis. Notice that your wrist itself cannot make that rotation on its own. If you hold the end of your lower arm, your wrist cannot actually rotate on that axis. It rotates on that axis based on the combination of movement of your ulnar and radius bones in your arm. Currently, when we rotate our wrist, the wrist itself is making that movement and we're not having any effect to our lower arm, and this is obviously not the correct behavior. So what we need to do, we need to devise some kind of system that will allow us to mimic that behavior, because if we think about it currently, we can't actually capture our geometry with this bone setup and have it deform correctly. There is no way that we could have it deform correctly, because we know that our arm, halfway down the arm, sort of needs to twist around based on our wrist. So you think, oh, okay, well, to get that twist, we need to parent to the palm bone. But then if we were to rotate our palm on the x-axis or the y-axis, then our arm would be coming along as well. And we know that's not the correct movement. So we need to devise a solution to the forearm roll problem. This is a very common problem that occurs with character rigs. It's the forearm roll problem. There are a number of different solutions to that problem, and I'm going to show you guys my personal favorite, and that's to actually mimic the ulnar and radius bones. So we'll jump over to the whiteboard. And if we draw out what we have currently, we know that we've got our upper arm and our lower arm, and then we've got our wrist obviously sitting at the end of the lower arm. But instead of just having a lower arm, what if we were to create an ulnar and radius bone? What if we were to create an ulnar and a radius bone? And in this case, they happen to be crossed over based on our wrist. But we control the positions of the ends of these based on the rotation of our wrist control around Z. So as we start rotating our wrist control around Z, we're controlling the end position. So we're controlling that overlapping where they cross or where they're not crossed over based on the rotation of our wrist. The other ends of both of those bones, the ulnar and the radius, their start end will be parented to what is effectively going to be our lower arm. That means that because they're parented to our lower arm, if our lower arm rotates, the entire bone will rotate for the ulnar and radius, and then the endpoints are affected by that twist effector. So now we have that in place. That means that we can deal with having a sort of twist that occurs only partway down the arm as opposed to occurring solely at the wrist or occurring all the way up at the elbow, but we do still have an issue. If you look at your bones, your ulnar and radius bones, as you roll your wrist, the outside of those bones when your wrist is facing towards you is still the outside when your wrist is facing away from you. When I say wrist, palm, I guess, of the hand is a better, more accurate description. So if you roll your hand through 180 degrees, the outside of the bones always face outside. That means those bones are also rotating through 180 degrees. But if you look at the skin around the upper part of your lower arm, near the elbow end, when you rotate your hand through 180 degrees, that skin doesn't really rotate through 180 degrees itself. It stays in the same position. That means we need our bone to roll based on the wrist control, but we don't want the bone to roll up this end. We only want the bone to roll up this end. So what we're going to do, we're going to take both of these bones. I'll draw them now without them crossing over, and we're going to split them in half. This is going to act as if it was one long bone, but this end will be responsible for rolling. So they're always going to occur on a straight line, and they're always going to be on a straight line based on the way we describe the ulnar and radius up here, such that they go from the elbow down and are controlled based on our wrist. But the end half, the lower half, the wrist half of those bones is going to rotate based on the rotations of the wrist control. That now means that we have 4 different bones that we can capture to, and that gives us the ability to paint weights to decide, do we want to be affected by the ulna, do we want to be affected by the radius, or do we want to be affected based on the twist by the wrist, or do we not want to inherit that twist if we're up near the elbow? So we have a lot of flexibility, and by painting weights we can get some very nice deformations that occur on the arm. So the way we're going to approach this kind of setup is going to be to create a clone of our lower arm. This is going to be a bone that is pretty much an identical copy of our lower arm. And you may ask, well, why are we doing this when we already have our lower arm? Well, the reason we're doing this is I want to be able to control a clone of the lower arm using inverse kinematics, so I can jump in and specify a twist effector. We can't do that on our current lower arm. It's already being affected by inverse kinematics. It's already being driven by the kinematics that are affecting our entire arm. We've got the upper arm, lower arm, and our twist control. So we don't want to affect it based on that kinematics. We can't go in there and put a twist effector. That will affect the whole arm. We need something that's unique for the lower arm. So we're going to have a clone of the lower arm, and that clone of the lower arm will follow with our arm perfectly. The way we'll achieve that is to have a bone that is parented under our upper arm, affected by IK, with the end effector being attached to the end of our real lower arm. So now we've got our clone of the lower arm following, because the end effector is following our wrist position, and the length of that lower arm clone is going to reference the length of our original lower arm. So if we stretch at all, we'll also match that. Now the reason we're going to do that, if we imagine we have our lower arm clone, we've got our wrist control. As our wrist control rotates, we can now create a twist control as a twist aimer for that bone, which means as our wrist rotates, that twist control will rotate round, and our bone will always aim to that twist effector, which means that now when we twist our wrist, we've now got a bone traveling down the length of our arm that is rotating and rolling based on our wrist's movement. We can then create the ulnar and radius bones that are parented to our original lower arm, but have their end effectors parented in to this lower arm clone. That means as the lower arm clone rotates around, their end effectors are going to rotate around, and that's going to allow us to drive that motion of the bones. We can also come in and specify this twist effector as the twist effector for those lower bones, the lower half of the bones that is going to twist, as opposed to the upper half of the bone that will not twist. So now we have the ability to create that 4-bone setup where we mimic the ulnar, we mimic the radius, the elbow part of that bone setup does not roll, but the lower part, the wrist end of that arm setup, does roll, and that gives us the 4 bones that we can capture our geometry to and have them working very nicely by painting our weight. So that's an overview of where we're going with the arm deform rig, is how I'd like to refer to it as, since it's going to be the rig that's really used for deforming our geometry, whereas the rig as we got it right now is more the animation control rig, because we've given the animator all the functionality they need. We're now layering some more systems on top of that to enable us to deform our geometry successfully. But that is an overview of the arm deform rig, and in the next video we'll begin the creation of that rig. Thanks a lot, everyone.